Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Real pleasure to welcome to the program Dr. Melvin Rogers, Professor of Political Science and Associate Director of the Center for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at Brown University, author of The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African American Political Thought. Professor, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
Very rudimentary question. I just want to start here. I'm a big fan of intellectual history. What's the value of it as a discipline? I mean, like where the sort of tracking the genesis of thought and intellectual strains within the context of a movement or of history writ large. Like, what's the value of it to us in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think there is a great deal of use in trying to get clear about the ideas that are responsible for structure in the world that we inhabit now. And the best way to do that is to go back in time and try to chart those ideas. Whether it's the ideas that we recoil from and we're trying to avoid, or whether it's the ideas that constantly seem to be a source of hope, that constantly seem to revitalize the present.
Yeah, it's interesting. We were just talking about J.D. Vance's sort of like a tour where he is sort of justifying, I guess at this point, like the spreading of these lies about Haitian immigrants, being legal or illegal, but even more relevant, or I should say undocumented, or even more relevant as to, what they're doing to the community. And it's helpful to know that this is, sort of like the rumor is generated by literal self-identified Nazis, because at one point the idea sort of mutates, or at least becomes like a different, I guess I talk about it like goes from a solid to a gas by the time it gets like expressed by maybe a J.D. Vance. But what the essence of it is. And that's what sort of, I guess, brings some light to it. So with that said, you are like, you track Black intellectual, I guess, thought through the early 19th century, maybe around the 1830s through into the 1960s. And the idea being that there is been widely considered two sort of, I guess, dispositions towards America and the American project, as it were, that place Black folk, or their perspective, having come as in this country, or come from slavery in many instances, most, particularly early on. Will you outline those two sort of like distinct sort of, I guess, flavors of thought, and then sort of place where your book is in terms of what the argument as to this other strand of thought?
Right. So the point of the book is to try to understand more clearly why it is African-American intellectuals and activists from, as you say, from the 1830s through the 1960s, to try to understand why they remain so committed to the United States amid ongoing practices of oppression, domination, exclusion, and the like. And when we go back in time to the 1830s, we see one of the lines of inquiry that I track, to just sort of put it in, I think, in simple terms, is a commitment to the American polity, a sense that the United States can be better than what it is, and a sense that the United States can be better than what it is in its treatment of Black people, precisely because the nation, white Americans, Black Americans, are not finished products. We're plastic. We can develop and grow. On the other side of this, I think, sort of against this view, is the idea, you see it very famously in the abolitionist and Black nationalist Martin Delaney of the 19th century, an extraordinary figure. But you see in him the idea that no, the degradation of Black people, the insistence on white supremacy, these are not just simply aberrations of American life. These are at the core of American identity. And therefore, Black people ought to strongly consider picking up and leaving. And you can see this strain in Martin Delaney, which is the figure I spend most time on. But if you were to come forward in time, you would see it again in the 1920s with that extraordinary Black nationalist Marcus Garvey. And if you came on up to the 1960s, you can find it in the Nation of Islam. And my book, in attempting to lay out those who were committed to the American polity, it tries to defend a set of ideas that I think are still active in American culture today, and that makes sense of why it is you still have the African Americans committed to transforming American society.
And one of those figures who I guess represents that that philosophy is David Walker. Tell us about him and his, I guess his most defining piece, I guess, is a pamphlet essentially he wrote in 1829.
Yes. So David Walker is born in 1796 in Wilmington, North Carolina. He's free because his line of freedom follows the status of his mother, who was free. As he grows up, he slowly makes his way north and settles in Boston in 1825 and quickly becomes a member of the small but growing African-American community there. David Walker is politicized by what he sees on his journey from the South to the North, and he is interested in striking a blow at the heart of slavery. And so he writes this extraordinary pamphlet, 1829. It travels along the eastern seaboard south. It reaches Georgia and Louisiana. And it is an incendiary text because it's partly a sort of call to arms to African Americans to stand up and answer the call of freedom amid practices of enslavement and domination. And it is also an attempt to sort of shake his white counterparts into understanding that the call to action by Black people is simply and significantly the result of a commitment that they themselves once fought for, a commitment to freedom, right? That which they fought for against the British crown in the 1770s. And in David Walker, you see, in some ways, both of those two elements that I identified earlier. On the one hand, you see a David Walker who is committed to the transformation of the United States, but you also see in that text a side of David Walker that says, look, if white Americans won't transform, then Black Americans must reevaluate their relationship to the polity and what those various options would mean. But David Walker, I insist, is a critical figure, and he's a figure that's then subsequently read. He's read by Martin Delaney. Frederick Douglass famously reads him. As you come downstream, W.B. Du Bois reads him. And so in this regard, he is a sort of signature and I think unattended to figure in American and African American political thought.
Speak a little bit about his perspective on Thomas Jefferson, because I took my kids to Monticello last year, and they came back a little more skeptical of Thomas Jefferson, I have to say. Credit to the tour guides there and whatnot, but I think like they were I don't want to say they were jaundiced, but I guess that's the point, right? Like you're riding that knife's edge on some level. Right.
I mean, David Walker, and this is historically both before David Walker and after, African-American intellectuals and activists have always had a very complicated relationship to Jefferson. because despite the fact that the Declaration of Independence is written by a committee, historically and how we sort of think about it in the public imaginary, Jefferson is its author. Jefferson is the one who articulates the sort of foundational values of the United States. This is sort of how we understand it. And Jefferson thus occupies a position, even in the 1830s, in the American imaginary that is unmatched by any other American founder. And Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia of the 1780s, had very incendiary things to say about African Americans and their moral and political capacities. And Walker, by the time he writes the pamphlet in the 1820s, 1829, Walker is very clear that we should not think Jefferson's words will just simply pass quietly into the night. That given Jefferson's status, it is a different level of critique and attack on African Americans. And for just this reason, he says, David Walker says, we must prove his words wrong. And what he means by that is that African Americans must do what they can to lay claim to freedom and perform the very thing that Jefferson is saying that they do not have the capacity to perform, which is to be self-governing agents and to recognize when that self-governance is in danger. The other thing I would say about this sort of Walker going after Jefferson in this pamphlet that is structured according to 4 articles, and in using the language of articles, it should bring to mind the Constitution. And the fact that he goes after Jefferson, and he is very clear that Americans don't seem to understand the implications of their words as written in the Declaration. It suggests, if you keep those two things in mind, the Declaration on the one hand and the Constitution on the other, it suggests that Walker is really trying to displace Jefferson as the founder to which one can look for guidance and install in his place the pamphlet that Walker is offering you. And if you really believe the words of the Declaration, then you will understand that the claim about the equality of persons applies to all human beings, regardless of their hue.
And what was contemporaneously with him writing that pamphlet, like to what extent were we seeing, particularly in the North, Black, if not self-governance, governance? I mean, like, or at least engagement with the political process as a citizenry. I mean, I think we certainly know in the context of Reconstruction, at least for a brief period of time, we saw a lot of like Black politicians in South Carolina and the Carolinas. I mean, ultimately there was this, blowback, or I guess, but within the context of like the 1830s, pre-war period, what existed that gave Walker that sense of like, this is a model for Black governance?
Right. So I think there's a couple of things to sort of keep in mind when we think about the early American Republic. The idea of politics and organizing was, or what we would call organizing, was a very capacious idea. So there was, of course, the formal structures of government, the recognizable institutions that we identify at the federal and state and city level. But then, of course, there's what we might consider the sort of informal practices of politics in civil society. So between the 1830s and the 1850s, for example, you had a developing African-American community that was producing newspapers, that was producing and developing literary and philanthropic organizations that established a Negro convention organization that could serve as a nexus point for bringing African Americans together to reflect on the great problems of their day, mainly the persistence of slavery and practices of domination. And all of these things essentially performed in an informal way practices of self-governance that they were formally denied in terms of participation in the state and federal government.
And that quality of civic virtue and whatnot, this runs up against, this is when I guess, Delaney would basically, I mean, how much did Delaney sort of eschew this, like, and just sort of say like, okay, just we need to leave, type of thing, and bring us forward in time as sort of Walker's ideas resonate, but still there's this parallel sense of, like you say, that traverses through time too, of this project is immutable in some way.
Right. So the thing I would say about someone like Martin Delaney is that all of the figures, whether we're talking about David Walker, the abolitionist Mariah Stewart, Frederick Douglass, as we come forward into the 1890s, Ida B. Wells, all of them agreed that racial injustice and practices of domination, those were the problems. And all of them agreed that what was generating that was claims about what race meant. But they disagreed on what the response ought to be and whether or not the United States was sufficiently flexible to become something other than what it was in its treatment of African Americans. As you come forward in time, let's say Ida B. Wells, the extraordinary Black journalist, who is now, where after the Civil War, the new manifestation of white supremacy, let's just call it that, is the lynching of Black people, and Ida B. Wells is going directly at that. Ida B. Wells also sides with David Walker in holding out the prospect of transforming white Americans. And the reason why she holds this out is because she does believe that Americans are attached to a certain kind of vision of themselves on the international scene. They do not want to be understood as both the so-called greatest defenders of freedom and the greatest violators of it, right? And so Ida B. Wells will often speak to a domestic audience, but she was also interested in speaking to an international audience in an attempt to sort of shame white Americans and the American government to a position of moral rectitude as it related to racial justice.
How did that, I guess, is a question of how did the intellectuals of this time borrow from, if at all, maybe internationalist perspectives or anti-abolition or abolitionist writers, maybe from Great Britain or other areas of the country, of the world?
Right. So, I mean, all of this is part of the, all of this is part of, let's call it the, Sam, I want to go back to your earlier term. All of this is part of the atmosphere of abolitionism. And whether it's in Britain or whether it is in the United States, all of abolitionists in various forms are sort of insisting on the commitment to freedom and equality. What they're struggling with in various ways are what are the sort of levers we can pull on to help induce in our audience, to help induce in them a desire to transform. And keep in mind, this is a period, and dare I say, unlike our own, this is a period in which ideas of virtue and character still matter. This is a period in which shame still matters. And so in their mind, appealing to the character of their audience and attempting to shame them into the right position, it was reasonable for them to hold out the thought that that could work. Right? Yes, the Civil War, if we go back in time, yes, the Civil War itself, the actual war, is responsible for the transformation of the United States. But the Civil War comes about because of earlier abolitionists engaged in rhetorical and moral appeals to their fellows, preparing the ground for the actual Civil War.
I think, I mean, and we'll talk about this briefly in a moment, but projecting forward, that embarrassment or sense of shame in the international stage, certainly like during the Cold War, that certainly helped, sort of, I guess, like move at least from an institutional level, civil rights forward. Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.